Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the core of everything. It's been reported that there's over several million earthquakes globally around the world every year by the United States Geological Survey, but there are other associated hazards with earthquakes. They not only can predict volcanoes, but they also cause tsunamis, landslides and avalanches. We do have a shout out actually. We've been flooded with messages from a Ms. S. Nami. So shout out to Sue. That's so weak. That's so weak. Right, okay. Carry on.
Thanks, Sue.
So what are earthquakes? So the British engineer named John Mitchell identified at the beginning of the 18th century that earthquakes are waves of energy produced by the shifting masses of rocks miles below the surface. So rocks are full of cracks and faults. And faults are when it's basically a crack in the rocks, but you have displacement or movement either side of that crack. And this movement causes stress to build up within the rocks. And this stress that builds up is called elastic strain energy. And this is sort of energy that's stored in an object due to the force that temporarily changes its shape. So it builds up when you stretch something or when you squash something. It's almost like when you're... I know we mentioned cheese a lot as an analogy, but it's when you're bending like a cheese and it bends slightly and it builds up in elastic strain energy and then it snaps.
Releases.
And it releases. And that similar principle happens for an earthquake. So it's the sudden movement along these faults that releases the elastic strain energy in the form of seismic waves. And these seismic waves move through the earth and along the surface and they cause the ground to shake. And there's a measure at which we can determine how destructive or how strong an earthquake is, and that's called the Richter scale, and that is the magnitude of this energy that's released. And it's a logarithmic scale, which essentially means that every number up is an order of magnitude greater than the one previously.
Order of magnitude being like 1, 10, 100, 1,000.
Exactly. So at a level of 1 to 2, we may feel something, but it might be undetectable to us. And then we get up to sort of 5. That's when buildings start to be damaged. So the New York earthquake recently was a magnitude of 4.8 on the Richter scale.
And the difference between magnitude 1 and magnitude 5 is 100,000 times stronger.
Right, because of 5 orders of magnitude.
Logarithmic, yeah.
And then you get up to sort of levels of 9 or 10, which is sort of the highest levels, and that's unspeakable damage. It's 10's very, very rare. It occurs every 100,000 years or so. In 1906, there was a earthquake in San Andreas that was a magnitude of 8, and it caused unimaginable amounts of death, major destruction. It's the equivalent of, get this, it's the equivalent of 60 billion kilograms of dynamite.
Wow.
Exploding. So
just all in one go.
All in one go. And it obviously shakes over time, but it's just, exactly, all in one go. And this earthquake actually gave rise to Henry Fielding Reed's proposed theory of this elastic rebound or elastic strain energy. And in terms of a magnitude greater than 7, there's only about 17 major earthquakes that occur every year. But they're rare, considering as though we have several million that occur every year. But when they do happen, we do hear about them. They shake things up. The question is, where do they occur?
Well, with this, we're talking all about plate boundaries again. So if you're not sure what a plate is or a plate boundary, go back and listen to some of our earlier episodes on plate tectonics and the Earth's interior. But basically these are kind of slabs of the Earth's crust, so the uppermost layer, and their relative motion between each other at the boundaries between these plates produces earthquakes, as well as volcanism and other things like this. So we've got a few different types of plate boundary. We've got divergent plate boundary. So this is where our plates are moving apart. These are constructive as well, which is where you're getting hot magma rising up. So an example would be the mid-ocean ridge in the Atlantic. Plates moving apart, magma coming up. And as those plates move apart, you get fractures forming because you have some kind of deformation. And these fractures cause earthquakes. It's that release of energy. So an example of this would be Iceland. Iceland sits over a divergent plate boundary. And so you get these earthquakes when the energy is released through fracturing. So that's divergent. We've also got convergent plate boundaries. So these are typically destructive. So one example would be subduction zones, where you get oceanic crust coming and meeting continental crust and sinking down below the continental crust and melting. These can often create kind of like island arcs and small mountains. And these generate earthquakes at that interface between the oceanic and continental plates.
And is that because, so that's the oceanic crust that sinks because it's denser, it sinks below the continental crust, and as it sinks below, I guess the pressure between one plate and another cause that build
Yeah,
up
absolutely.
of stress.
You're thinking about this huge mass of rock that's kind of sinking down and grinding past all these other rocks. So an example of this would be the Peru-Chile Trench in continental South America. So this is where you have the Nazca plate subducting under the South American plate.
And actually, these subduction zones produce the most powerful earthquakes, and they can be typically above a magnitude of 6 on the Richter scale.
Great. So in these convergent plate boundaries, we've also got continental. So this is where two continents are meeting. So an example would be the Alps, where you've got the Eurasian plate meeting the African plate, or also the classic one that you probably learned about in geography, the Himalayas, where you've got the Indian plate moving up and into the Eurasian plate and creating lots of deformation, faults and folds.
So the idea here is that as a plate, imagine you've got like a rug on the floor and you're sort of pushing the rug and it starts to fold upwards like that. That's sort of the idea that we've got here. There's not loads of subduction, but it just, as you push a rug together, it just folds upwards and crumples upwards. Exactly.
And in that process where you're deforming all these rocks, kind of you start to get this energy building up, because it doesn't get, a rock's not a fluid. It's fluid-like, but we can't release that energy straight away, and then it builds up, and then it releases and causes that earthquake.
I guess the point is that you have ductile rocks that sort of bend slightly, and then you have brittle rocks that just break instantly. Whereas in the case of earthquakes, in this scenario, we have rocks that are being pushed together, so they're being folded upwards, forming mountains, and they do eventually break, cause things like reverse faults and those technical terms. But those reverse faults and faulting cause this release of energy.
So as we've said earlier, these earthquakes can be really dangerous. An example of an earthquake occurring at a convergent plate boundary was the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami in the Indian Ocean, which hit predominantly Indonesia and had a catastrophic death toll, over 230,000 people across 14 different countries. And what we had here was the Indian plate was subducting below the Burmese plate, and we had a release of energy about 19 miles below the seafloor along a fault. And from that, you got a fault rupture. So that's where the rocks basically just kind of move along each other and break apart. And this was the longest that's ever been observed.
Yeah, it was estimated to be up to 800 miles long, this rupture. And it was faulting, so this release of energy was going for 10 minutes. That's the movement. And according to some papers, it's estimated that it caused the planet to vibrate as much as 10 millimeters, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's certainly enough to cause. As you 230,000 people died, and its magnitude. Remember our magnitude on the Richter scale, the most destructive are 9 or 10. This was an 8.8 magnitude.
Wow. So that's convergent plate boundaries, and then finally we have transform plate boundaries.
Yeah, with transform boundaries, these plate boundaries are conservative, meaning that they sort of move side by side on each other. They don't push or compress each other. They just move, or they don't move apart from each other. They just move side by side. So these earthquakes are at a very shallow depth relative to something like subduction zones, where you have one plate sinking under the other, but they are quite large. So they're not as strong as convergent boundaries, but they are more destructive, as they are found in urbanized areas. For example, the San Andreas fault in the USA is a strike-slip fault, and that's always reporting different earthquakes. And in this scenario, San Francisco is actually moving towards LA by approximately 2 inches per year, because they're on the different sides of this fault. And there's also an example of the Anatolian plate boundary as well, which runs through Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and Crete. So they do run through these urbanized areas and can cause a lot of destruction, including the one we've already referenced today, which is the 1906 San Andreas earthquake.
And I have a feeling that there's a story that I remember about that earthquake where I've seen pictures where like farmers' fields have been displaced, and you actually have their fences or marking their boundaries of their farms or whatever have moved like 10 meters and are maybe now crossing over with their neighbour's land, but one of them's gained sort of 10 meters of land and the other one's lost it.
Right.
And I have a feeling that there's some stories around that about kind of land ownership, and it's no one's fault that there's been an earthquake.
Yeah.
But you still have to deal with the kind of the fallout from that of like, well, what do we do now? Do we remark our boundaries? Does someone just get more ground?
I don't know. Yeah, poor farmer. He's lost his land. He'd be quaking in his boots.
Nice. Yeah.
Should we keep going? Should we keep going with these, or should we just leave it there? Are you trying to find the article now?
I'm trying to find it.
Well, whilst you do that, I'm going to go quickly down where else do earthquakes occur? Because obviously you've got plate boundaries, but they also occur in other areas. So, for example, the recent New York earthquake that we all heard about last month, New York's not really close to a plate boundary, but it is close to a lot of faults. And one of these cracks or faults is called the Ramapo fault, and that is seismically active. So it's 185 miles or 300 kilometers long across the New York state. And that's the leading hypothesis for the cause of the New York earthquake, which I think had a magnitude of 4.8. But also you get volcanic eruptions, and the pressure builds up within sort of magma chambers within volcanoes also cause earthquakes. And actually there's always tremors. There are always tremors before volcanic eruptions, and you can predict that a volcano is going to erupt based on these tremors.
Is that what, like, animals can sometimes detect these tremors, right? I feel like there are examples where kind of dogs start running around.
Yeah, I think there's something to do with the fact that it disturbs the electromagnetic field, and a lot of birds, for example, use things like they use that for navigation. The other thing, we might as well, that prompts us into the have you found the article?
No.
That does prompt us into our section. A weekly section now is What in the World? And
what have you got for us this week?
So there are two things. Firstly, it's been shown that you can use the behaviour of toads to predict earthquakes.
Go on.
So before an earthquake, gases can be released underground as the plates and slabs are moving around. And a study by the Open University has shown that on the surface, like small ponds and puddles, the chemistry of the pond changes based on the gases that are released from the subsurface.
Wow.
And as they do that, toads start to jump out of the water. It's probably not to their taste.
Yeah.
And they jump out of the water, and then once the earthquake finishes, they come back to the water.
Wow.
And that was so there was a case where they looked at toads that were disappearing before an earthquake in Italy in 2009, and they came back afterwards due to the temporary change in water chemistry.
That's really interesting. And that kind of thing, like, it makes me wonder, are they jumping out the water because of the changes in chemistry and temperature, or are they just jumping out the water because there's an earthquake?
Well, I mean, this is before the earthquake actually happens, isn't it? It's not like it's shaking and then they're jumping out. The gases are released, I assume, because there's some kind of disruption. It's a good point, though. Yeah,
that's really interesting, though. I like that.
And the other What in the World that we've got this week is on March 11th, 2011, an 8.9 magnitude earthquake hit the northeast coast of Japan. I don't know if you remember hearing about it. It was quite a big earthquake,
I think so.
And it actually changed the length of day. And the reason was because the earthquake altered the distribution of Earth's mass, which caused it to rotate slightly faster and shorten the length of day by 1.8 microseconds as well.
Just for Japan or for everyone?
For everyone.
Wow.
Because it can't alter the length of day for Japan.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are my two What in the Worlds.
They were great. I really enjoyed that. While I was looking for this story about San Andreas that I couldn't find, I did find that it's been reported that by the USGS that the latest forecast for this San Andreas fault is that there's a 7% chance that there will be a magnitude 8 earthquake in California in the next 30 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that because an earthquake of that magnitude is rare, and something like a magnitude of 10 only happens every 1,000 years. So they must be coming up to the time frame at which we should be expecting another very strong earthquake.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's just kind of like computational models of when we should get them, or whether it's actually looking at kind of whether they can get any sense of what's happening.
I wonder it's because, so if you imagine so the strike slip fault, again, we have two bodies, rock bodies that are moving side by side to each other. And the fault, if you imagine this cheese analogy, it's sort of slowly starting to bend as you push one side against another, and it slowly starts to bend. And I wonder if we've got a similar case there in the San Andreas fault, where the pressure's building, and they're predicting when the elastic strain energy builds up so strongly that it overcomes the resistance from the bending and just snaps. Okay, so what can earthquakes tell us about Earth's structure?
Well, we talked a bit about these seismic waves. So these are basically energy waves moving through the Earth when you get an earthquake, and you need a medium to be able to carry that energy. So our media here is the rocks that the Earth is made of. And as these waves travel through the Earth, they get changed in certain ways that you might remember learning about back in school physics. So you've got things like refraction and reflection. And the refraction is basically a change in the speed and also the direction of that wave based on the properties of the material it's traveling through, particularly the density of the layers. And we can detect these seismic waves all around the kind of the surface of the planet. And so we've got the crust at the top. Continental crust is quite thick, about 70 kilometers. Oceanic crust is about 10 kilometers. And then we've got the mantle, which is very, very dense. And as we have these seismic waves that can pass through our mantle, and we have P waves and S waves, primary waves and secondary waves. And these can travel through the mantle because they are solid. And so there's a bit of a change as these waves go from the crust to the mantle, because you have a density change. You can kind of mark where that boundary is based on kind of where these waves appear and how long it takes for them to appear. So they can travel through the mantle because it's solid. Then we have the core at a depth of about 2,900 kilometers, which is made up of iron and nickel, and the outer core is liquid, inner core is solid because very high pressures. And we basically get what's called the shadow zone, which is where no seismic waves can be detected on the surface because our S waves can't travel through liquid. So they disappear. So basically imagine kind of we're here in London and there's an earthquake here. Those S waves propagate through the ground, but as they hit the outer core, they can't penetrate through. So there's going to be an area kind of on the opposite side of the Earth, effectively, kind of behind the core, where those secondary waves, those S waves, don't penetrate through, and so you get the shadow zone. But you can detect the waves elsewhere on the Earth's surface, America or...
So if you say directly below us directly south of us is Australia on the other side of the Earth, you can say that when you get to Malaysia, it's still detecting S waves.
Yeah.
And then you go further down to Singapore, it's still detecting S waves. And then some point between Singapore and Australia,
you lose those S waves.
You lose the S waves. And that must be because there's a liquid layer within the surface.
On that, I learned something quite interesting yesterday about antipodes. Do you know what an antipode is?
I think it was a Doctor Who baddie, wasn't it?
Yeah, maybe.
I'm pretty sure it was.
Adipose.
Adipose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, an antipode is like a kind of geological or geographical term for the point on your planet that's completely opposite where you are. And I saw a really interesting map where they basically had a map of the Earth, the kind of the flat projection. I can't remember what that is. Is that the Mercator? Or and then they had superimposed over that map the same map but upside down, and then you could match up all the points on the Earth that overlapped with other points. So, for example, South America, flip it upside down and kind of reflect it on that map, and then that overlaps with sort of Eastern Russia. New Zealand overlaps with kind of Portugal, I think. So the UK doesn't have a landmass antipode. Ireland does. It's some islands off of the southeast coast of New Zealand, because if you kind of flip New Zealand up to the northern hemisphere, you have to go a little bit past New Zealand.
You must have seen those maps where you get. That's really interesting. You must have seen those maps where you get the relative size, actual size of places like the UK, and it's actually compared to somewhere like Africa, it's so small.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't know. It must be the perspective of the globes, the maps that we draw must be from our perspective, or the fact that you're bending the longitude and latitude to make sure it's flat, I guess.
It feels like that's a whole episode in itself, like map projections.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like we get lost in it.
Yeah.
Ironically.
Yes.
But P and S waves are used for detecting earthquakes, but actually the earthquakes that cause massive destruction, if I remember rightly, they're L waves, and those are the ones that travel along the surface. And those are actually the ones that travel the least distance, but obviously they have the biggest impact on us. And that concludes our episode. Mark, that was a really interesting episode. Thanks very much for digging deep and doing some research.
Yeah. Yeah.
One hopes it's groundbreaking.
You can just keep going, can't you?
Yeah, I've got them all written down. No, I haven't. Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for listening, and look forward to next time.
Thanks, Jack. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.